We are concerned not merely with the technical problem of securing and maintaining peace, but also with the important task of education and enlightenment.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. This is Grant Cameron, and I have a special interview today. In the world today, there's a whole series of people who are living in abject poverty, running around, just trying to survive. There are a host of people who are refugees running around the world with no place to go, nothing, no country that wants them. There are a whole host of people. Most people are living in quiet desperation, just basically trying to raise a family, make money. I, on the other hand, got to play in the Super Bowl, and I got to deal with the biggest story of all times. And today I have two guests with me who have are playing in the Super Bowl with me. And we're going to discuss the latest book that they brought out. So first, let me introduce my good friend, Paola Harris, who we've known for a number of years. We've talked, and Paola, can you introduce our special guest, who may be like a quarterback or a big player in the Super Bowl here with us? And then we can go to the book that you two have suddenly come up with.
Yeah, hi, Grant. Grant and I have been very good friends for a long time, and he always comes to my Laughlin conference because being a really great researcher and discussing consciousness is what I like to do with Grant. So I am very honored to be here with Grant and with Jacques Vallee. Jacques Vallee is truly a quarterback. I mean, he's described himself to me like that every now and then. So what I'd like to say is that the collaboration with Jacques Vallee on this particular case, this one case in 1945, the recovery in San Antonio, New Mexico has changed my life. And Jacques has agreed to do interviews together because we've been working together. And Grant, it's been top secret for 4 years. So yeah. You didn't know anything. And we were really good at it. It's been top secret for 4 years because we've had to go on location at least 3 to 4 times a year. We've had to go back there. We've had to check things. We've had to bring scientists. We've had to do a lot. So finally, Grant, we can talk about this. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce my partner in crime here, Jacques Vallee, to talk about how we came together to do the book. Now, I was working on this in 2009 on my own and had gone to San Antonio, New Mexico, interviewing both little boys. Then, Jacques, will you talk about how you were working on it and we came together to work on it?
I had been people have accused me of not paying enough attention to UFO crashes and to recovery of materials and so on. And that's a valid accusation, and I plead guilty. For a long time, I'm a computer scientist, and that's what I can bring to a team that does this kind of research. I have no illusion of solving the UFO problem by myself, but I can contribute an analysis. So I've been concentrating on looking for patterns of large numbers of cases across the world. And when I used to discuss, Roswell and other cases like Roswell with Dr. Hynek, the discussion always came to the fact that we didn't have enough data. There were references, but the witnesses were afraid. We didn't know their names. We didn't know where they had gone. It was hard to trace anything down in actual physical reality that we could take to the scientific, to scientific opinion, to the scientific community. when I became aware of some of the more recent research, of course, now we're better equipped to do research and to do real analysis of samples. And I've been working with a small group of scientists, both in France and in the US, starting to look at those samples. And that led me to go into looking at sites like a site near Dayton in New Mexico. I knew New Mexico a little bit, and I love that state because it's so spectacular. There's such a variety of cultures, a variety of traditions, and of course, many reports of UFOs concentrated, especially in the mid to late 40s, like Roswell. So there is a lot of work to be done there. And I had been looking at a site near Dayton in New Mexico, where we actually dug up. I went there several times with a friend of mine who lived and worked in New Mexico. His family had long history in the state with cattle and with other work in the state. So I was becoming familiar with the challenges of trying to reconstruct what had gone on with those crashes that the UFO literature talks about. And the friend who had been with me at Dayton took me to San Antonio, New Mexico, not San Antonio, Texas, San Antonio, New Mexico, where he told me that a remarkable case had happened in 1945 that very, very few people knew about. Unfortunately, he was killed before we could go to the site together. He had started to, he was killed in a car, with a car accident before we could actually go to the site together. But then I became aware that Paola had been doing research on that case for 4 or 5 years before I even became aware of it. So we were connected by a common friend who was a researcher in Los Angeles. And then I had to start catching up with what Paola had been doing. And the case is unique. It is incredible. I just got a message from an executive in Silicon Valley who said, if it wasn't you guys writing this book, I'm halfway through it and I would ask for my money back because it's so incredible. My response to him was, if it isn't true, and Project Manhattan isn't true, then maybe the whole United States should ask for their money back for the Manhattan Project, because a few people had looked at the case. It happened in just 2 days after the capitulation of Japan, a month after the explosion of the first nuclear bomb, quote, test at Ground Zero in New Mexico. And the people who've written about it have concentrated on the object and who the witnesses were, these 2 little kids that Paola talks about. They just forgot about the atom bomb. They forgot that this came out of the sky literally over the area that was protected by the army, that was confiscated, essentially. The army had authority over that entire area around White Sands, where the first plutonium bomb had been exploded 4 weeks before. There are 10 things that are unique about this case that have not happened in any other case. The witnesses were there before the object arrived. This is not like, oh, there is a story, somebody saw something in the sky, it might have crashed, and 3 days later, some guy on a horse goes by and finds some remains and calls, as was the case in other situations in New Mexico that I've researched, as well as Paola. But in this case, the kids were there. Now, why kids? I mean, a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, Mr. Padilla and Mr. Remy Baca. They were there because, you know, all the adults were at war. They had not been demobilized yet. The war was coming to an end, but most of the adults were still in uniform and dispersed around the world. The kids had to take care of the ranch for their father, and they knew the territory, the ranch, that area that was leased from the government was 80,000 acres, okay? It was a large area. The kids had horses. They were tracking the cattle. They knew how to use a binocular to read the brands on the cattle to find out where the cattle was. And they were there on that particular day because they expected that one of the cows would have given birth, you know, but they had to find the cow, find what was going on, if it was all right. And they found it. They reported it to their father. And then they went back to the site. And then there was an object came out of the sky, hit a big communication tower, which was there, which was one of a number of communication towers around the White Sands area to direct, you know, airline and aircraft and military aircraft traffic around the area. And then the object didn't fall apart the way an airplane would have fallen apart after hitting that tower. The object kept its integrity. It just lost one panel, and it came to the ground under power, dug a trench, a long trench in the ground on the ranch, and then made a turn and came to a stop. The kids knew that if you were witness of an accident and you might be the only ones on the site, you had to bring support to whoever might be injured and call for help. They were the only ones there within miles and miles of open New Mexico territory. And so they rushed there, not knowing what they would find. And they realized that this was no airplane. And through the opening that had been made in the collision with the tower, they could see three, what they called little men, short men, about as tall as they were, about 3 to 3.5 feet tall, who were alive and were moving around. So that was the scene. And that is completely unique in the history of, you know, UFO encounters, of UFO crashes. And then they were able to stay there and to observe and to be, you know, hidden away in the bushes and observe what the army did over the next 9 days, that the army came in and recovered the craft and obviously took it away. So we called our book the best kept secret, because the Army and the Army Air Force kept the secret until today, actually. And the kids kept the secret. And that's the other thing that's unique. You know, at Roswell, the witnesses testified right away. Here, the kids kept their secret for 60 years. They, when Roswell happened, Roswell, you know, is relatively close to there. Even Socorro is just 8 miles north of where they were, almost true north of where they were. They never said anything. They never spoke to the press. They never came out with their story. And there were a couple of good reasons for that that we can go into. Now, you know, Paola had done the initial research. There were these 2 witnesses, and then Paola found a third one. One of the initial 2 witnesses is still alive, Mr. Jose Padilla. Remy Baca died a few years ago, but Paola had been able to record his testimony. So we have a complete record, day by day, blow by blow, of the entire investigation as they were witnessing what the Army did.
Okay, let me ask one question about many years ago, I talked to Wilbert Smith, who ran the Canadian government program. I talked to his son, and he confirmed to me that just before his father died, he had confirmed that he had seen the bodies and seen the craft. So immediately, my first question was, so were they grays? And he said, no, they weren't grays. They were just little people, what you're describing. Is that what the beings were? Is that what they were described? Because you see in the Roswell thing, everybody wants to move the grays back to that period of time. So can you describe the beings that they were seeing?
I should let Paola, describe what happened to the witnesses as they were observing these beings, but it's not as simple as that. It's not as simple as the ufologist would like it to be. I had really the privilege of having the transcripts, the exact transcripts of the analysis and the interviews that Paola had done again and again, from both initially from Rome and then later from the United States, of both Remy Baca and Jose Padilla. And what I try to do is a sort of linguistic analysis as I was editing. Obviously, it had to be cut down, it had to be cleaned up a little bit. And I wanted to do that very carefully, protecting what they had said. Paola is an incredible interviewer. Her background, relates to that, but I could never have done that kind of an interview. And she gained the confidence of both of these witnesses and let them recall. And I was struck by the fact in her transcripts, they talk about something in the past. I went there and I was on my horse and I saw this and, there was a storm and so on. And then when it comes to the little people, they go to the present tense. I look at them, they are hurt, they are crying. I don't understand how they move. They don't walk, they just translate themselves from one place to another. And then, I was asking the same question you're asking, are they little men? Well, they talk about them as if they were little men, about their size as a 9-year-old kid, except that from time to time, they talk about them as if they were insects. They compare them to campamocha, which is like a cricket, like a large cricket, but they were humanoid. Their head was larger than their shoulders, which is described in the grays, the head is very large. They had 2 eyes. They were making a sound that, Paola can describe. So the kids were mesmerized by them, but in the transcript, they go from talking about them as, quote, men, and talking about them as insectoids. And they were mesmerized by the scene. And there was no linguistic communication, but there was some form of psychic communication, for lack of a better term, between these beings and them. The beings had no breathing equipment. They didn't have, they had sort of a gray thing that was close fitting on their body. So if you want to call them grays, you can. So, but the book is mostly about that case, but there are 2 other cases in the literature that are very similar. And again, that's the computer nerd speaking here. I look for patterns. And there is a case in France that has been researched very extensively. As you may know, I'm a member of the scientific group in France attached to the Space Committee that looks at those cases. We have the transcripts of all of that. And there is a case, of course, the famous Socorro case, in which I was peripherally involved with Dr. Hynek. In all 3 cases, you have these short beings who breathe our air and seem to communicate telepathically with in all 3 cases, it's not a flying saucer. There is no flying saucer in the book. There is no disc. It's always an ovoid, an egg-shaped object the kids at Trinity called it an avocado. Now, Paola can tell you the background of how we came to this, because I'm just giving you sort of the instant, the instant framework, but there was a lot more that happened before I became involved.
Okay, Paola?
Okay, well, really, I want people to understand that this is not a UFO book. This is a history book. And this is the benefit of working with someone like Jacques Vallee. Because when Jacques was putting together the framework for this crash, he had to read extensively about the Manhattan Project, about Oppenheimer and Einstein and Fermi, Enrico Fermi. And so the book starts with the diary of Laura Fermi about the day that the bomb exploded. We've got to understand that this is not a situation where whatever's flying there is on vacation and just happened to crash. There's a very real sense there of history and of the turning of history, the importance of it. And when Jacques was starting to work with this, he was reading these books, and I learned a lot because, as Jacques said, I just did the interviews. I love doing interviews. All my books are interviews. But I never look at the context. I never look at the framework. I never look at what's going on when these things happen. So he would read a book about, the Diary of Laura Fermi, and I would buy it and I would read it. And then he read The Children of the Atom Bomb, and I read it, and we would read it, and we understood that this book is so rich because it's a history book. And so we did go to ground zero, because I'll let Jacques talk about this. Coincidentally, we happened to pick a date to go back to New Mexico where they opened up the ground zero Trinity site. It was traumatic for us all to be walking, in the place where the atomic bomb exploded. When I met the witnesses, the fact that they were children meant a lot to me. The fact that these are children recounting what happened. And just like, the case in Africa, the case in Westall and in Australia, children have an incredible memory, and children don't make things up. They are traumatized by it. So the book is rich because, number one, it's a history book, Grant. Number two, we're dealing with children. We were dealing with Jose Padilla and Remy Baca, and then I found the third, and she's a little girl. She was a little girl, Sabrina Padilla, and we can talk extensively about her. She's at the end of the book.
And who is she?
She is the cousin of Jose Padilla. And she was living in the house of Jose's mother and father. And Jose had left when the little girl saw long pieces of foil, and she saw what looked like fiber optics. And Jose didn't even know about this because she never talked to him, her own cousin, about this, because she was living in the house. So we got this incredible testimony at the very last minute. But let me add that being on location with a Jose that is telling us where he stood when he saw the creatures, when he saw the little men, because the location is precise. We don't have to go through 3 miles of fields. The location is precise, and his repeating what he lived through, that he thought these beings were hurt, that he heard them making this high pitch sound like a crying baby, or he said, like when you shoot a rabbit and it makes a high pitch sound, that he wanted to go in and he wanted to help them because they were there for at least an hour and a half with their binoculars. But then the 7-year-old began to cry because his eyes were burning, the mesquite was burning, and he wanted to go home. These are testimonies of interaction with beings just after what seems to be a crash that are so precious to this book. But I want to remind everybody again, it is a history book.
Okay. You mentioned the association to Trinity, which is what the book is called. And we know that a lot of experiencers got the message about stop the atomic bomb, even back into the 1950s. and the stories about the nuclear weapons being shut down and Robert Hastings' book. Is there a message here with this first crash?
How could you not call it a message? You know, you have this event that is super secret. They don't even evacuate the people around ground zero. There were 70,000 people there who were going to be affected by this nuclear explosion, this nuclear test, as it's still called in the literature. Everything was secret. They had to stop the war in the Pacific, to stop the war in Japan by any means. Many people within the military did not want to use the bomb. The people who wanted to use the bomb, including President Truman, you could argue, and I think historians will argue, that it was the right decision in terms of saving lives. But this in the long run. But the intensity of that moment, I don't think people today in the United States or in Canada can understand what it was like. That moment changed history. For the first time, men had the power of essentially destroying civilization, all of it, in a few weeks or months. This craft is, you know, why if you were an advanced, so, you know, my colleagues in science, in astronomy, space science, say, come on, Jacques, I mean, if you were an advanced designer of spacecraft from Alpha Centauri, you know, 1,000 years ahead of, why would you design something that's going to crash into a tower? I mean, you know, our airplanes don't crash into towers. I mean, we have radar, we have communication system, we have all of that. Why would they do that? Well, it didn't exactly crash. It hit the tower. There had been a thunderstorm just a few minutes before. The thunderstorm was moving away, but this thing happens out of nowhere. It hadn't been tracked by radar around White Sands. It comes over this thing, and it's under power when it essentially does this crash landing. But as Paola was saying, these three creatures are still alive. How can it be? And one of the hypotheses we have to make is that this was a gift. The kids spent 9 days watching what the army did. And again, we spent a lot of time in the book reconstructing the context, because again, that's the reason you have, you know, an Indian leader, woman, you know, Mama Grande, standing there on the cover. This was Apache land, this was Indian land, and Spanish-speaking, you know, land. When the army came to talk to the father of the kids, they spoke Spanish. The officers were Spanish-speaking officers. The kids knew the territory completely. The reason they rushed to the scene was that they knew that there was a war going on, that there was danger, that there were airplanes falling, that there were people, you know, dying, and that the first thing you had to do was to bring support to whenever you were there. The 9-year-old was driving the truck, the family truck, okay? Because again, all the adults had gone away. So you have to put yourself in that environment of the time. And I spent a lot of time sort of in the landscape by myself, walking around, letting the land tell me its own history, because this didn't happen just anywhere. It happened in an area that's sort of a hollow where rain tends to accumulate. So cattle has traditionally been brought there. That's also an area where the Indians in the 19th century and early 20th century used to have the tribes would come together. It was a ritual area for the Apache. All that tradition is something that I had to discover. And thanks to Paola, I was able to speak to some of the Apache, who remembered the tradition from the area, who were from that place. After that, most of the Apache tribes moved west into Arizona from New Mexico. But I had to immerse myself into that and understand all that, because the land is not just any piece of land. It's a very inspiring place where you can tell that a lot of history has happened. The other thing is just the atmosphere of the end of the war itself. Many people had died. The families knew that many people would not come back. And it was important to get a souvenir. And we'll talk about how the kids approached that experience. They wanted to watch everything. They were mesmerized by what happened. The army didn't expect this to happen. They sent, a bunch of 18-year-olds who were available, who were about to be demobilized, but they would be kept for 3 months more at ground zero in the barracks around where the bomb had exploded. So they were the ones who were available. They had no idea what they were picking up. The army kept talking about a weather balloon. Well, the kid's father had a bunch of weather balloons. I mean, the army was sending weather balloons every day to test the winds and so on for the planes. And the 80,000 acres, the balloons are going to come back. The farmers collected them. And when they came to his house talking about the weather balloon, he said, "Oh, do you want some weather balloons? I mean, I've kept them for you." And he gave them a bunch of weather balloons that he had collected on his land. This was no weather balloon. We reconstructed the physics of the object. The kids had measured it. We knew approximately the weight. The object was between 5 and 10 tons. So this was no weather balloon. But they went on sort of brushing away all the questions, and then everybody forgot the case.
Now you sort of stole my next question, which goes to the idea that you brought up, that if a very advanced civilization were to come here and crash, doesn't make any sense, or the fact that they would not have recovered their own craft immediately, because if we have a craft down, and my father was with accident investigation in the Canadian government, and I know he talked about the one time a U-2 was down, that the American military was there before the Canadians got there. So this goes to the question of, you mentioned this thing about the gifting, and in a recent interview, Bob Bigelow, who's a friend of yours, was being interviewed by George Knapp, and he was asked about Roswell, and he said, "Well, yeah, there's Roswell, and I think there was one in Russia, and there was one in China, and there was one in South America, and I think they're seeding them." And Tyler D., who I think you also know, referred to this other crash site in New Mexico as the gifting field. And this goes to your little pieces of metal, which also don't make sense to me, is that little pieces of metal are falling out of the sky, that this advanced craft comes from wherever it's coming from, and then little pieces start falling off it, where you get the memory metal that you couldn't bend with a sledgehammer. It would deflect bullets, but when it hits the ground, it shatters like a wine glass. It sort of gives the indication that we are being gifted this material. Do you believe that there may be part of that we are being given some assistance in terms of understanding that we aren't alone and that the world is more complex than we think it is?
I think I may have been the one who started that idea that it was a donation, that they dangle something. I mean, look at what we can do. Because on the last day, let's jump to the last day. Now, the thing has been recovered after bringing an 18-wheeler to recover the weather balloon and building a crane, a special crane to lift the thing and put it on the truck. They put it on the lowboy that's behind the truck, and they put it sideways. Well, why sideways? Well, it's egg-shaped, and if it's upside, if it's up, it's not going to go under the overpass on the highway to take it back to White Sands. So they put it sideways. And then everything is under top, and the soldiers are happy. They go to the local bar. Nothing can happen to it, except that the two kids are still there. And they say, we need a souvenir. Now, when I spoke, with Paola, we spoke to Mr. Padilla, whom we've gotten to know very well by now, after a few years. That idea of a souvenir, I mean, why a souvenir? Why was it so important? Well, in every family, there were people who were not coming back from Germany, or not coming back from Poland, not coming back from other places around the world, in Japan and so on. So souvenirs were very important. If you had something that had belonged to the father, to the uncle, to someone in your family, your brother, you wanted to keep something, it was very important. That was the only thing that you would get back. And so the kids knew that, and they wanted to get a souvenir, so they went inside. In fact, this is also the only case where 3 people have gone inside a UFO, an empty craft, without being abducted, to investigate it, to measure it, to see what it was made of, what it was like inside. Now, the last day, it's sideways, so the kids can see under the thing. The thing is about 15 feet high, okay? And where Mr. Padilla was walking as a kid, when he went inside, he said that the height was about 12 to 13 feet. I asked, well, how did you know that? I mean, you were a 9-year-old, how do you know? Well, he said, that's the size of a beam. If you build a new house, that's the size of the average beam. Well, these kids were smart. They were smart because they grew up by themselves in the middle of a war. They had to take responsibility for what they did. They were not playing around. They were not doing what, your kids or my kids are doing. They had to work, they had to serve, they had to, and so we know those dimensions pretty well. Well, under the floor, which was flat, there was another 3 feet. Well, what was in there? I mean, if you're looking for where the propulsion system is, which I think that's what, people in those different agencies are looking for right now, there was no opening. There was just about 3 feet by something like 10 feet maybe of space where, if we think of it as a propulsion system, it had to be there. And there are no openings, and there is no smoke coming out. There is no sound coming out of it. What was it? What can we learn from this? Okay, so those are some of the questions. So as Paola and I, when we talk about the case, we're very aware of the fact that this book is just the beginning. It's not the end of an investigation.
So what happened? So what happened? And I'll add, Jacques, the little boy walked in. He wanted a souvenir, and what he saw was a plaque on the wall, and the plaque looked like he didn't see any nails or anything, and it had a round circle that looked like copper. In the middle was this, what Jacques and I call a bracket. It looked like some kind of handle or whatever, and it would rotate. And so that is what Jose, and it was just Jose that went inside, because Remy handed him the crowbar to pull the bracket off the inside. What's unique about this case is that we have the witness's location and a substantial piece of metal. When I first started working with them, I had seen the bracket in Gig Harbor, Washington, at the home of Remy Baca. Who had been there was Timothy Good. So Timothy Good had this case in his book, plus he had done some analysis on the bracket. The other person that mentioned this case, and we want to give credit to, is Ryan Wood, who has the book Magic Eyes Only, that has 93 cases. That book is, for me, a reference book. So Jacques and I looked at that because 1945 is in there. So we have this piece of metal called the bracket. And then when Remy passes on, Jose gets the bracket. And I'm working with this thing, and I put it in a safe deposit box here in Colorado. And because he gives it to me, he gives me gifts. He gave me that gift. When I met Jacques, I gave him, quote unquote, the bracket. And that is what, it's amazing. You haven't gone there because most of the UFO researchers, all they care about is the metal and the bracket. But let me add one thing, Jacques. I have here a souvenir. This is the cane of Mama Grande, the Apache. It says Maria Amanda Chavez, because what Jose gave to me is her cane, and what he gave to Jacques as a souvenir, because they believe in souvenirs, is a rain stick from the Apache and a series of cufflinks that have, pistols on them. This is how these people think. So, for me to have this, to have had the bracket, and then I gave it to Jacques, and you can ask the metal questions now if you want to.
Yeah. I can speak to the fact that I've actually handled it. If you recall, I was in Boulder and we went to those people's house, and he said, where am I hiding it? And I said, I don't know where you're hiding it. And he pulled it out of the back of a TV. He had it hidden in the back of the TV. Remember that?
Husband.
So let's go to the bracket. Is that and let's clarify, is that the only piece of hardware? I heard one interview you guys were doing that indicated you might have more than something else.
Well, I think we'll keep it vague.
Okay.
Because there's a long history of things appearing and disappearing in various ways. So, to be completely truthful, I would say we don't know what we have. Okay. People have already told us what it was. Okay. That it's an ordinary piece of, industrial thing. It's worth nothing and so on. It shouldn't have been there. Or they think of some retro gravity invention and so on. We don't know. And that's the most important thing that a scientist can say, is we don't know. Because if we knew, there wouldn't be any point to do research. We really don't know what we have. Superficially, and also the interesting thing is, obviously, I'm in Silicon Valley. I've lived in Silicon Valley for a long time, for over 40 years. And I have many friends here, and I know where the bodies are buried, and I know the history of a number of companies, some of them dead. So I have access to labs, I have access to people who have resources and instruments, but more important than that, I have access to their thinking. And I've always seen my role as being, as serving a community of scientists from different disciplines, because no one discipline is going to have the key to this problem, to the UFO problem. You need a team of scientists who can work together, who can exchange information, challenge each other. And also you need, the computer science guy, I think of myself as more of an information scientist, if you really want to pin it down, as sort of the connecting tissue among all of that, so that when they have a question, I should be able to come up with elements that are useful in their research, and I understand the terms they use, but I couldn't do the research they do, okay? So that is the condition where we are. So within that atmosphere, which is typical Silicon Valley, free over breakfast, you make up something new and you look for challenges, we don't agree, and that's healthy. Some of my colleagues say, well, you know, it's an ordinary, we know the metal. I mean, you know, it was analyzed, Timothy Good had it analyzed. There were 3 analyses that were done, one in Mexico and one in the United States. And so we know what it is. It's an alloy of aluminum called silumine. It's basically aluminum, but they add some things to the aluminum to make it stronger. And it's, you know, there is a code for it in the metallurgical books, and you can buy it as an alloy. So that is not, you know, extraterrestrial material, presumably, because even if I made something like that, they wouldn't make it to the exact composition, you know, that's in the industrial books that we have. So it's human. So what is it doing inside, you know, something that just crashed from the sky with an exquisite, you know, propulsion system we don't understand? And why all the mystery? Well, you know, my response was, look, guys, you know, the army was far away from a source of power. They may have been able to generate power from the Jeeps. You know, I used to drive a Jeep. You know, you could use it to generate power. That's one of the amazing things that the Jeeps do. But the way it was described by Mr. Padilla, this could be something that they improvised with a bracket they had that they found somewhere. Maybe it was part of the debris from the tower that the object hit. You know, there were all kinds of things. And you could wrap a cable around it. You could use it to, maybe it was spinning around this, you know, you think of a copper circle. I mean, Paola said there was this copper. Well, copper is obviously conducts electricity very well, and you could, if it spins around, you could generate power. You could do something. So you start thinking about that kind of thing. On the other hand, when you look at it, yeah, you can buy something very much like it. In fact, you know, with you get on eBay, and Paola gave me this. This is an actuator. You know, so it has a hole here, it can spin, and when it spins, it can move things that are attached to these holes here. Now, this is a very simple one. Again, you can get it on eBay for, you know, for a small amount of dollars. And there are many configurations of those things, except that the one we have doesn't have a brand, okay? If I look at this, this has a brand and it has a number inside, okay? You can read the number. So you know where it comes from and you know all of that. The one we have doesn't have any indication, doesn't have any markings. It looks pretty crude, but it looks like it was done just for this. The other thing is that also it's in the metric system. Well, metric system 1945 in the middle of New Mexico would be pretty unusual. The Army wasn't using the metric system. Everything was in inches. We've measured it pretty well. You know, Silicon Valley is good at that. Put it under a number of different instruments, microscopes, everything else. And it hasn't revealed its secrets yet. So we're still torturing this bracket to find out, to force it to tell us where it comes from, who made it. Some of my colleagues say, no, it looks like an ordinary bracket. And maybe it had the function of an ordinary bracket, but there may be structures inside it. And by the way, we don't know what it was attached to. So let's not rush to a conclusion yet. So people will say, well, we know what it is. Well, they don't know what it is. We don't know what it is. That's what, you know, what you do when you do research.
I'm so glad you saw it, Grant. I forgot about that. You were here in Boulder and we were hiding it and you happened to be there and you saw it. And you didn't probably know then that, well, Jacques wasn't involved when you were here. So I was trying to deal with this by myself. And let me tell you that I'm so happy for the collaboration with Jacques, because I found out that in collaborating, when you work with a story, it is so much better. You can bounce things off people. He lent so much to this book. This book is a masterpiece of writing. And I am so grateful, and may I encourage people to work together, because I don't think this is his story or my story. I think this is humanity's story.
Wow. Now we're running out of time, so I have to get my big questions to Jacques, which I've always wondered about. There's a story about that was told about you, Hal Puthoff and Kit Green meeting in a Denny's restaurant and coming up with the core story. Is that true? And that leads to the question, do you think the government has made any progress on all this kind of material? Or as happened yesterday, I don't know if you're familiar, President Biden was asked about UFOs yesterday, and it related to a statement I didn't really hear, that Barack Obama had said, we've got videos of this, but we don't know what it is. And so they asked Biden, and Biden just said, well, go ask Obama again. So what's the core story? Do we have any connection? I know one time you talked about we've understood some of the metal stuff, but do we really have any idea what's going on here?
There are several questions in your question.
I'm running out of time.
Well, yes, we met at Denny's, and we have a long history with Kit Green, who brought mostly the medical side of all this, and again the analytical side, and Dr. Puthoff with the advanced physics, and we compared the things that puzzled us. But I think quotes from presidents are important, quotes from senators are important, but they're not going to, again, I'm going to show you my Silicon Valley. No, this is not the way things happen in science. They don't happen because the president has decided something. It's very rare. It happened with the atomic bomb. It didn't happen for the computer. It didn't happen for, any number of things we have. It didn't happen for DNA. In fact, DNA, the government had given up on DNA. And then one bright scientist found a different approach that was, orthogonal to everything the government, all the funding, all the budgets had been set up, and they couldn't get anywhere. Within 10 years, they didn't think that they could get anywhere. And then he revolutionized the field. I had a discussion about this with Federico Fagin, who is an Italian physicist, who is
there we go.
Who was the pioneer in Silicon Valley, who gave us, the computer chip essentially, and then was an entrepreneur and ran a number of companies, one after the other, all with innovation, starting with Intel and other companies. And I told him that, I was a little bit afraid of going public with the research I was doing, because, so many people in science are skeptics. And he said, don't worry about the skeptics, If we stop looking at things like this that we don't understand, things that are beyond the frontier of today's science, we might as well sell Silicon Valley to the Japanese, sell it to some other country and go home, because it means we've lost that spirit, that intensity, that, relentlessly we have to look at the things we don't understand, the things that nature gives us, the possibility that there are other forms of life, other forms of consciousness, other forms of intelligence. We know there's got to be, in the rest of the universe. So that's what we need. That's what we need to do. And we don't really care if the president says something, or, it's good that, if there is more attention put on it, maybe it's good. I don't think it's good if it's put on it just from the military standpoint and the idea that this is a threat. Sure, if somebody knows more than you do about propulsion, about atomic secrets, about radiation, you have to be concerned. Are they friends or enemies? How do I deal with them? That's That's a valid question. But in terms of science, that's not where you start.
You mentioned Fagin and the idea of the dream, where you get stuff in dreams and stuff like that. You had a sighting in 1955. Can I ask you if you had anything else after that? Because usually you have people who have more than one sighting. And have you used this? I wrote a book called Inspired, The Paranormal World of Creativity, where I look at different inventions and Nobel Prizes and how they were actually came in dreams and inspirations and stuff. Have you used that in your career in terms of consciousness? Because you were the first guy to really go to consciousness and this idea that it's a little more complex than just nuts and bolts.
Well, it made me aware that there are other levels of reality. And that's really the lesson. You know, there is one thing that the UFO phenomenon as a whole, the big thing, teaches us, is that this is not the real reality. That there is another, and I object to words like the paranormal. There is no such thing as a paranormal. In fact, you know, Wilbert Smith said that, you know, that there is only one super reality, most of which we're not aware of. And we live in this sort of time, space, flat world. And there are other things that come and go from the rest of reality. And that, you know, what could be greater as a challenge to a young scientist? So seeing that thing sort of made it very clear to me, because I wasn't alone. I mean, there were two other witnesses, one of which was a good friend of mine who was studying engineering, was about half a mile away. He saw the same thing I did, and he had binoculars, and he described it exactly in the same terms I did. So I knew that thing was not some sort of mirage or some sort of early prototype of a jet or something, that this was real, and I thought a couple of times that I could explain it with technology, and I was wrong.
We go here to this idea that I'd ask you maybe sort of as a concluding question to talk about where do you think the UFO field should go? Because, you know, everybody's all divided, everybody's going in different directions. And since your book has sort of come out, people have sort of gone back to, you hear these comments like, okay, here we go again. Now we're back to nuts and bolts. These are little aliens in flying saucers and stuff like that. So what would you suggest if somebody's coming new into the field? What should be the focus? Where should the attention be placed in order to solve this mystery?
Well, first, we need to talk to the witnesses, you know, and you and I have been witnesses, and that's changed our lives in many ways. And you know, I also have friends who have high clearances, and they tell me, Jacques, you know, you don't have that level of clearance. You're not anywhere close to the atomic clearances. These are the atomic clearances that, you know, the people who took that craft away, you know, had the R, P, and Q clearances. They didn't have the clearances that go to the president. They had the clearances that go to the Atomic Energy Commission, okay? That's a big difference. But I tell them I don't need the clearance. I've got the two kids, and I've got the testimony from Paola. And then we didn't talk about the third witness. We talked very little, you know, but Paola found this young girl who was there after Mr. Padilla had gone on, had moved to California, became, you know, joined the army, went to Korea and so on. He wasn't around anymore. That little girl was there, and she was a very smart little girl, Sabrina Padilla, and Paola had several interviews that are in the book. And that's why we had to postpone publishing the book, because when we saw that there was another, you know, 20 or 30 pages we had to add to the book, because it nailed down everything else. And that's the way you have to do it. And by the way, yes, this is nuts and bolts, but you know, that's where you have to start. But there was that psychic component that kept coming in. Just one example, the kids say, you know, we were watching these creatures go around and crying. And we say, well, how long was it? And they say, well, maybe 15, 20 minutes. They were there for an hour and a half. can you imagine? I mean, anybody who has had kids know that a 7-year-old and a 9-year-old in the field by themselves are not going to stand there for an hour and a half, mesmerized by something that they see. They kept passing the binoculars and staring at these creatures, wondering, should we go? And they were crying, and they're asking, should we go and help them, or is that what can we do? You know, this is not just an airplane. And they are there mesmerized for an hour and a half, and then they have these visions coming to their mind that we have, Paola has, in the course of talking to them, has sort of made them sort of regress gently to that time. And again, they go to the present tense when they talk about what they see, from the sky, the much larger thing that you'd never expect, a 9-year-old to tell you about.
I said it was my last question. I lied. I always lie. One more question. And that deals with, you talk about a database all the time, that you want to take this database and get people to analyze data. Does your data include material like data on what experiencers are saying, rather than the craft and how fast and what colors and stuff like that? In terms of, like, a lot of them will talk about, time disappears, or they knew the answer to everything in the universe, or all these bizarre things that experiencers will talk about. Is that part of your database?
Well, I made a presentation. It's on my site in Paris, when the French Space Agency gathered researchers from 5 countries, government researchers from 5 countries, to compare notes about this thing over 2 days in Paris. No public. It was only a closed conference, but it's been, widely disseminated. My presentation is on my site. It's not one database. In that presentation, I'm talking about a data warehouse, essentially, because you cannot put the pilot sightings, in different vocabulary than that a farmer would use, or a scientist, or a businessman seeing something. So you have to, and also they all talk about the particular frame of time. So there I have a chart where I have about 12 different databases, including the Blue Book files that I spent 4 years analyzing with Dr. Hynek when I was his associate in Evanston at Northwestern. And we compared the American files, the American databases, with the French databases that I brought to the US when I came to this country. So we are working on, it's like, an organ that instead of having just 1 keyboard or 3 keyboards, it has 12 keyboards, and you have to play music on all 12 simultaneously. Well, we've added a few, and my background in computer science was in using human language instead of using codes. So one of the things I've done is I've kept the testimony in full English in many of those cases that you talk about. And that's the way, and I've been taught to analyze the silences, the oh, well, and all the hesitation, the changes in tense in those. And that's where you have a lot of the richness from witnesses who were in shock or were in an altered state of radiation. I'm very happy that you interviewed Preston Bennett, because all the people who talk about the effect on people are talking about the injuries and the people who were killed or people who were hurt. And that's where the idea of a threat, they are here to test their advanced weapons on us. And but Preston Bennett talks about hundreds of cases where people were healed. And I have cases that I've never published because, where are you going to publish them? But where I continue to do research where people were healed in Europe after being close to a UFO. So we should, again, dismiss this other notion that if you get close to it, you'll be hurt. Jose Padilla wasn't hurt. Remy Baca wasn't hurt. and there was no effect on them from the object. In other cases, there are people who have been hurt. As you know, I've researched that in Brazil, and in other places in Latin America. That's true, but there are also cases where people were healed. So you have, this particular case brings out all of that. It's a meeting place for all these ideas, and that's why it's so rich and important.
And Grant, I want to also reiterate that you and Jacques will be in Laughlin November 12th through 14th. So people that want to speak to you both should really attend this historical meeting November 12th through 14th at the Aquarius Hotel. And you know, because you've been with me so often, that you and I are like a lot of the advanced thinkers in the area of consciousness, where I call it the Graduate School of Research anymore. So may I encourage people to work together, number one, to come and discuss in person. And I'm very grateful to you for asking the questions that you asked and for having us here.
Beautiful. Can you close it off, Paula, just by describing what was Paul Hynek's role in all of this? You meant he's on the mentioned.
Yeah, well, Jacques and I never met when I worked with Alan Hynek. We met later on in life. And I knew Paul when he was a child, and Jacques knew him when he was even smaller. So we just all reunited lately. And when we went together, I sponsored a reunion in New Mexico of Sabrina, who is the niece of Jose Padilla, and a reunion after 10 years. And we went to the crash site, and they were very emotional because they were reliving it. And we brought Paul Hynek with us. So like Jacques and I are like surrogate parents for Paul Hynek. And we brought him, and what was beautiful, really beautiful, was that Jacques took Paul to the Lonnie Zamora site, where Alan had an epiphany dealing with that case. So here he is, his son, Paul, looking at the exact site that his father had a reaction to. I don't know, Jacques, you want to add that about the Lonnie Zamora site, where that
was? Well, that was a famous Socorro case where we, in the book, we bring some new data about that case that people didn't know about, that hadn't been published before, certainly not in book form. And I see my role in all this, at my advanced age, of trying to transmit not just the data, but the meaning behind the data. And that's, I think, the way we can. Paul is an example of, the next generation of researchers who can be the link with, what happened in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and all along.
Beautiful. It's been an absolute honor. Two of my assistants, Sinead Wellahan and Nicole Sakic, were very envious of me that I get to interview the Frenchman. It's been a total honor. And Jacques doesn't attend many conferences, which is why they should be going to Laughlin. He doesn't do many interviews, so I'm extremely honored to have this chance. It's been a highlight of my career of 46 years, and thank you for all the work you've done and for moving the field. Because as I point out to people, I used to think Jacques Vallee was crazy, this thing about it could be more than extraterrestrials and stuff. And now I said, now I'm down the same road. And the guy, I think, is right. This is much more complex. And I think the UFO community owes you a big round of applause for moving us away from just simple, this is ETs, nuts and bolts, and that the world is much more complex than we think it is.
Indeed.
Beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Got it. Okay. Was that okay, Jesta?
Right.